Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today for a discussion around maximising recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm Charlie Netherton, I'm the Head of Client Advisory Services at Marsh UK, and I'm joined today by Nick Fool, who's our Head of Strategic Risk Consulting, and James Krask, the Global Head of Business Resiliency. Those of you following our risk management webcast series will know today's topic looks at the actions organisations can take to begin to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. Decisions taken today will have a very real impact on how successful your organisation's recovery from COVID-19 will be in the future. Today we're going to explore how organisations can navigate uncertainty using data-driven insights, risk expertise, and agile decision-making to identify and win the recovery. In particular, we will touch on workforce impact and return to work forecasting, how organisations can better estimate workforce availability, and when teams' locations can return to work using proprietary models. We will discuss return to work plan development and how you can meet your obligations to employees, regulators and insurers as your workforce returns to the workplace. We'll also explore business restoration plan development and how you can better understand your value chain's counterparty risks and where to focus restoration efforts for maximum effect. Finally, we're going to look at business impact forecasting and how you can project the operational and financial impact on your business across the consequent economic scenarios. Today's session is the final chapter in our series of risk management webcasts. If you missed any of our previous sessions, please visit our events page on marsh.com/UK to view all the webcast replays and to download the slides. Next Tuesday, we're holding a special COVID-19 claims webcast at 1 p.m. You can sign up on our website or you can register via the replay email that will be sent out after this session. Before we start the discussion, I want to encourage the audience to submit any questions you have through the Q&A tab at the bottom of your computer screen. Questions are covered towards the end of today's session. If we can't get to your question today, someone will get back to you soon with an answer. I'm now going to introduce Nick Fool and hand over to him. Nick is going to kick off today's session. Nick, over to you.
Thank you, Charlie. So I'd like to start by emphasising the importance of having in place a strong crisis response to ensure a strong recovery. So this is the result of research undertaken by Marsh in the last couple of years. And here you have the difference in share performance for those organisations perceived to have had effective resilience in place at the time of a crisis versus those that did not. And although both groups, as you can see, suffer an initial dip in share performance, you can see how those two quickly diverge into a 17-point difference in share performance between the two groups over the course of the ensuing year. Some of the commonalities of those in the top group, the strength of a leadership's response to a crisis appears to have been the single most important hallmark of those that thrive. Swift, accurate, transparent communication had a positive effect in regaining the market's trust, and tested risk management, IT resilience, business continuity and crisis arrangements really increased the speed of the recovery. So today we're going to talk about the steps organisations can take to ensure that they're part of that top group. So if we look at the coronavirus pandemic specifically, the first thing to note is that this is a crisis like no other. It's rapidly evolving with no clear economic end path, and as such has given rise to a number of compounding factors for businesses. The first of these is trying to ascertain the impact on their supply chains, where they are potentially not fully known and often with little resilience or redundancy built in. The next is the rapidly evolving policy responses, which differ by country, by industry, as governments grapple with the uncertainty. And then there's the wealth of data and often inconsistent projections to digest for how the pandemic and the economy itself will respond. And finally, we've seen that business continuity plans that organisations have had in place in many cases have not survived contact with the crisis. So the result of this is that responses have been, these inflexible responses have been inadequate for this rapidly evolving pandemic. It means critical decisions are having to be made without full data availability or having had it assessed properly. One of these is, of course, the difficulty in knowing when to bring resources back on stream, by country, by sector, by product. And it means that maximising the resilience across the value chain is near impossible, sort of in the ensuing post-pandemic world, without a deep understanding of how the business is impacting and the operating environment that it will operate in. So with those challenges in mind, let me hand over to James, who will talk through some of the questions that organisations are asking in light of this.
Thank you, Nick, for that introduction. And so with this context, we are being asked very different questions from a wide range of stakeholders within the organisations that we're working with. The questions range significantly from very practical concerns on one hand about returning to work, to much more strategic queries around an organisation's strategy, the economic volatility that may impact upon the business, how the supply chain might react, how customers might react. The challenge that we face right now is that all of these questions need to be considered and answered together. None of these can wait. We shouldn't just be limiting our focus on just what is in front of us right now, which for many are questions around the operational issues about getting staff back into premises and getting production processes ramped up again. And the reason for that is because how you phase your return to work will depend upon the broader economic situation, changes in demand for your services from customers, whether the supply chain will actually be there for you when you restart production or return to the office. So we need a much more comprehensive approach to tackling these questions than perhaps we would typically for any other type of crisis or disruptive event. And what I want to do now is start to explore how it's important to properly structure that approach to enable a better coordination across your business in tackling the challenges that we face. And for me, there are a series of components and precursors of what makes a good recovery plan. The first is related to data. We have all been bombarded with data over the last few months, much of it contradictory, and much of it very difficult for decision makers to understand. So we need to discard all of the noise and focus on the things that really matter to us from a data point of view, and make decisions based upon a set of trusted data that will help us drive the business forward. But of course, the data is only part of the issue. We also need to understand our operations and their risks in detail. So for those organizations that are starting to think about ramping up operations again, knowing which part of your organization is critical over and above anything else actually helps you inform where you may focus your recovery planning activities. And you need to stress test your operations as well against a broad range of both economic and epidemiological scenarios to explore what the medium and long-term impacts would be or will be on your business, so that can be reflected in your recovery plans, and ultimately get to the point where you have a very sound understanding of what the financial impacts are going to be, both upon your business and the broader supply chain, and what that might look like post recovery. A couple of tips at the bottom, I think, that we're picking up from conversations that we're having with clients right now. First is that really important to be transparent with staff on the risks and your plans. This is a highly stressful situation for us all, both as individuals, as employers and employees. So communicating the risks that you're facing and what you're doing about those risks and how you intend to recover the business is critical. If you lose trust of staff at this point, your ability to recover the business effectively will be significantly damaged. Clearly, we need to be focusing our efforts and analysis on or basing it upon data that is trusted. Discard that daily noise. Be ready for bumps in the road as we begin the recovery process. So that may come from your supply chain, where disruptions seemingly come out of the woodwork, or in your workforce or wider operations, and use data to drive your operational decision making to support you through the crisis process. But let's perhaps start to explore how we put some of this into practice. So here at Marsh, we've developed our thinking into 5 key areas, which aimed at giving clients insights into into the sort of issues that they need to be planning for, and helping them develop very practical plans to address both the operational concerns that are facing them right now and the broader strategic issues that the business will need to address. So the first component of what we're doing relates to data, the point I made on the previous slide. So we are in the process of working with clients to model a range of different coronavirus scenarios over the medium and long term to explore the impacts of those scenarios on the business. Now, why is that important? One, because it actually helps you understand when you might be able to start the recovery and when you might be able to go back to work in the various different geographies that you're operating in. And the second reason it's important is because it gives you all of the data that you need to help develop realistic and credible recovery plans that capture not only the operational issues that you need to think about right now, but also those longer term financial issues that will be coming down the track. The second component relates to people, which is clearly the number one concern for most organisations, and has been right the way from the beginning of this crisis, given the nature of this scenario. So return to work planning seeks to address questions around who might be able to go back to work first, how they might go back to work, and what environment they will go back to. So clearly we cannot expect to be working, at least in the medium and probably the long term, we cannot expect to be returning to the same place of work that we left before only a few months ago. So some very practical sort of issues in that pillar of work. The third area relates to the business. So that's all about business restoration plan development. And when I'm talking to organisations about this, I tend to describe it as a reverse business continuity plan, because that piece of work relies upon a very strong understanding of what is critical in your organisation and the resources that you require to maintain those critical activities and services. And having that data helps you decide which bits of the business you'll prioritise for recovery, and therefore which bits of your workforce are likely to come back before anybody else. And then all of this is underpinned by some detailed models to help organisations stress test their financial position and to forecast their financial future and what the impact will be on the business's P&L, balance sheet, cash flow, healthcare costs, etc. So taken together, what you have here is a very comprehensive framework that takes data at one end and uses that data to help organisations plan the very operational and practical issues that need to be addressed right now, and also uses the same data to help decision makers at a very senior level within organisations understand what the impacts will be on the strategy and on business planning. What I'd like to do now, though, is just sort of pause in a bit of detail on the more sort of operational activities that or issues that we're facing right now, because I think for many organisations that's really front of mind. It's certainly front of mind for all the organisations I have been talking to over the last 10 days or so. And we're finding that the return to work is infinitely more complicated than the decision to furlough staff or move staff to remote working or shuttering facilities, sorry. And that's because we're dealing with behaviours and people's risk perceptions. So this comes back to a point I made earlier on about being transparent with your staff. I think having written some of these plans for some very large global organisations over the last 10 days, communication with staff is absolutely key, and bringing them along the journey and explaining why you're doing certain things and encouraging them to open up into a debate on the circumstances under which they might be happy to come back to work is really, really important. And the reason for that is that if they feel uncomfortable about coming back, or if they have any concerns about how the organisation is safeguarding their safety, that will cause massive issues for the organisation as you move into the to bring staff back into work. So the sort of things that I won't go through all of this in detail because there's a lot of context on this page. If I just pick out a few of the sort of more common planning activities that I've seen in organisation. First is phasing of people. So we've seen employees think about which members of staff will go back first versus others. So that tends to be focused on the more critical parts of the business, the critical roles that support those bits of the business that need to be operational for finance or reputation reasons. We've also seen organisations think about keeping the physical separation between certain critical teams that they may have had prior to closing down their facilities or moving to remote working. And the reason for that is that it helps to reduce the risk of potential infection, wiping out an entire critical team at any one go and leaving you with operational difficulties. We're also seeing organisations updating their plans and playbooks for dealing with employees that may have tested positive. So questions about contact tracing, the communication that you need to make to staff once an individual has been once an individual has tested positive, all need to be thought through, and that process needs to happen very quickly. Remembering that your workers will be in a heightened state of anxiety potentially as they come back to work. We're also seeing a significant focus on vulnerable employees and thinking about the special measures that might need to be put in place to make sure that the safety of those individuals is maintained, and remembering that actually those individuals may have caring responsibilities at home and may be looking after vulnerable members of their family at home, which also potentially put them into that group. And something on transport as well. I've seen a number of particularly city institutions that are talking about how they might be able to encourage staff to avoid public transport. And one organisation I was working with is actually suggested that anybody who doesn't want to travel in by public transport will be fined to use a taxi to get into work, and they can claim that back through expenses. Now, I did a very basic sort of calculation as to what that will cost the business, and it will be around about $2 million a month to actually deliver that policy. And the reason I'm telling you that story is because anything that you do in this stage is going to have a cost implication on the business, and needs to be weighed up against the benefits that the risk management benefits that it provides. In terms of the physical workspace safety, I think we're going to come back to offices that look very different and workplaces that look very different. So if you're in an office environment, I think we'll end up with lower occupancy in some of our buildings for a time, increased desk spacing, the closure of communal areas like canteens and coffee breakout areas. And in production facilities, I think we'll keep some of the staggered shifts that we've seen in certain production environments to reduce the number of employees that are on site at any one time. And I'll also think we'll see lots of activity around enhanced cleaning, probably PPE for certain members of staff, and for some maybe some temperature checking when colleagues and visitors are coming to the office or the workplace. And I think a lot of that will be delivered not necessarily because it helps to reduce the risk. I think a lot of it will be delivered because it helps to encourage staff or tell staff that it's a safe place to come back to. It's sort of managing people's anxieties. So there's a lot that needs to be done both in the short term and in the long term. What I think we ought to do now is just explore in a bit more detail what the epidemiological and economic models look like that underpin the work that I've just walked through. So I'll hand back to Nick at this point.
Thanks, James. So yes, just to emphasise, we use a common use end-to-end modelling approach, and we would recommend that organisations use something like this to enable the rapid decision making that's required to manage their recovery successfully. So our modelling approach encompasses an epidemiological model, which models where we are now and how the pandemic could evolve in terms of number of cases and fatalities based on the various suppression and recovery strategies being implemented by country, as well as the potential future scenarios. This provides input then into our economic modelling capability, which translates the epidemiological output into impacts on key macroeconomic drivers such as GDP, inflation, unemployment rates, etc., and on which we can overlay different what-if economic scenarios, again by country and sector. We can then interpret those scenarios within a range of organizational client-specific modules to inform one, workforce impact and return to work forecasting. So for example, by helping identify those employees that are most vulnerable, for example. Two, the operational impact, so impact on productivity, on supply chain, on staff availability, and finally, how to translate all of that into the financial statements of the company, so P&L, balance sheet, cash flow. So all of this together really gives a sort of flexible and fast platform to enable different what-if scenarios to be played out, and then sort of a few weeks later, say, when there's new information, new data to understand what's changed and thus informing sort of new decision making. It'll also enable the longer term view to be taken to see how the impact of the current crisis will play out over the multi-year time period. So let me just wrap up with the sort of three things to take away from today in terms of things for organizations to think about as a priority. So one, engage and maintain contact with your communities, suppliers and staff. So we heard James talk about it already. Transparent communication is key, as well as being responsive to their needs. Number two, understand the impacts on your business. We recommend through scenario-based modeling to capture the range of possible outcomes in the short as well as the longer term. And finally, develop your return to work and business restoration plan. So based on the scenarios that you've considered and the needs of your workforce. So with that, I'll hand back to Charlie.
Nick, James, thank you so much for taking us through that today. A very interesting view of what businesses can be doing to respond best to maximise their recovery from the crisis. That concludes the main part of our presentation for today. But we've had a number of questions come in while you've been talking. So I'll if you could both join me back on the screen, I'll ask some of these questions to you. So. First one that's come in, maybe for James. The world didn't seem prepared for this crisis. Why didn't we see this coming?
Yeah, very good question. And this has been in the World Economic Forum's risk register for many years. It's on the UK government's national risk register as one of the top risks. And a lot of work was done on planning for this issue. Both in government and in business, but I think we took our collective eye off the ball, and the reason for that is, in my view, because organisations were busy dealing with the next big issue, which, if you remember, just a few months ago was Brexit, and prior to that was something else. And I think the way that traditional risk management processes work mean that some of these really high impact and low probability risks get deprioritized off of our agendas, and therefore don't get the treatment that perhaps they should do. I think in the future that's gonna change. I think we're going to need to be much more ambitious and creative with our scenario planning. I mean, I've picked up so many business continuity plans written prior to this crisis that in their scope statement at the beginning clearly say a global pandemic is out of scope of this business continuity plan, or it makes an assumption around a crisis that doesn't impact upon all of their locations globally at once. Now, of course, you know, this crisis has blown that kind of assumption and that sort of scope statement out of the water. So we're going to have to take a very different approach to planning in the future.
And so what do you think the most significant change will be in how we work after this crisis, and particularly how we think about risk management and resilience?
I think number one, we'll see a lot more scenario-based stress testing to validate the plans that we have in place, or to test the sort of plans that we have and check whether we need any new ones. I also think we'll see at a more operational level greater integration between the risk management world and the business resilience world, the business continuity people. And it struck me as strange for a long time that those two disciplines in many organizations don't typically work closely together, because there's a lot that we could do collectively that would make both activities more effective. You know, on one side, the risk management function has a lot of data about the sort of issues that the exec and the board are concerned about. And on the other hand, the business continuity people have a very good understanding of the operational detail around what would happen if certain bits of the business were to be disrupted. Well, why aren't they integrated? I think we'll certainly see more of that. So a combination of scenario stress testing and a much better integration.
Thank you. So turning to the future then, a couple of questions have come in here, asking about how to identify and take advantage of opportunities presented in the crisis. So firstly, what can people be doing right now in order to emerge from this, not just in the best possible position to recover in the short term, but also to maximize their opportunity in the long term? And related to that, like, how should people be spending their time right now? Should they be looking at all of the risks in detail, or should they be waiting to see what their organization looks like in 6-12 months' time?
So answer the first question first. I don't think we should be waiting. I think we need to be acting now. my advice would be organisations should take that scenario modelling approach to explore the range of different futures that may be present in the next 6 months, 2 years, and then use that to help identify what needs to be done, one, to protect the business from further disruption, but also to spot those opportunities. So if you've got data from those models that tell you that the demand side into the business is going to look very different in 6 months' time, well, that needs to be factored into your planning now. I was talking with a large retailer 2 weeks ago, and they were predominantly, prior to the crisis, a bricks and mortar business. They had lots of stores around the UK, didn't have much of a web presence, and what they've done quite successfully is radically changed their business literally over a weekend. I was talking to the finance director, who said that on the Friday they closed shop, and on Monday they turned themselves into an e-commerce business. They saw the need to change. It was always on their radar as something they needed to do, but as the CFO and the finance director told me candidly, we would never in a million years have been able to achieve that within 48 hours, which is what they did. So they used this opportunity, or this crisis, sorry, as an opportunity to change the business, and seek more aggressive timelines to change the business. We've also seen that in Italy as well. And when first set of infections started to come into Europe, within the banking sector in particular, where banks have radically increased their online presence to offer remote services to clients.
Thank you. So a couple of questions come in. First of all, this is being recorded, and there will be a replay link sent round, along with a link to a copy of the material for those of you who've been asking online about that. So that will come out either by the end of today or more likely on Monday morning. Another question's come in here around the risk exposure for EL and PL claims as company plans for employees and business partners to come back to work in the office. So that's been addressed in earlier parts of our webinar series. So again, if you go to marsh.com/UK, you go to our events page or our coronavirus hub, within there you can find replays to the earlier parts of this series, which will give you good answers to those questions. Another question here though, coming in around what potential liabilities to a company around temperature checking of employees or visitors with regard specifically to data collection, security, privacy, what decisions will be made against what level, etc. James, I know that you've been working with a number of our clients on these sorts of questions. Without maybe addressing the liabilities specifically, you could talk about what other companies are thinking around this.
Yeah, it is actually a minefield when you start digging into it, and the organisations that I've seen are considering this are finding challenges around, one, getting hold of the equipment in the first place, two, getting people that have the appropriate training to use the equipment, and three, getting appropriate people that can interpret the results that are displayed on the equipment. And then there are questions around how you test the equipment and calibrate the equipment to ensure it gives you the right results. I've seen organisations consider it mainly as a means to demonstrate to staff that they're doing something, and that they're using these as a sort of visible, very visible means to communicate to staff that that they've got their safety interests at heart. But I think anything like that needs to be considered in a much broader set of solutions, from at the very basic end, just good personal hygiene, through to cleaning of workplace environments, to social distancing, and to communication to staff about what you're actually doing.
Yeah, thank you. A couple of people here commenting that they've actually trained their receptionists to take temperatures with staff coming into the building. Somebody else here suggesting that you could maybe make that a voluntary process for people to opt in. A number of questions though coming in around our thoughts on the various tracking and tracing apps. So we've obviously got the ones being developed by the NHS. You know, somebody else is asking around how to test and contract staff, trace staff that become ill at work. What does this take? What apps do you need? What processes do you need? How should companies think about this?
You don't necessarily need apps for this. I've written a few plans that deal with this issue, and they're 3 or 4 pages long, and involve contacting the member of staff that has either self-declared that they have symptoms or has tested positive, and asking them who they've come into contact with at the office and elsewhere, and then making those individuals aware. Some of those plans go into detail about, well, if we can't speak to that individual, what can we do about getting access to their diaries through the system to work out who they may have met over the last 2 weeks. That includes external visitors as well. And then contacting them appropriately. The key thing though is to have a pre-agreed script that you use, both when you're talking to the member of staff that may be unwell, and also when you come to communicate to other members of staff and in particular visitors. Because that communication could cause more anxiety than perhaps it's worth from a risk management point of view. So you don't necessarily need to have an app to do that. And in fact, there are some quite significant data security issues that need to be thought through before going down that route. And my personal advice would be to use solutions and tools that have been officially sanctioned by the public authorities, rather than building something yourself.
Thanks, James. A quick one here that I'll answer. Do we have any thoughts on health and safety obligations for home workers? When should we assure staff have the right facilities? They're not just working from a sofa or a picnic table. I'll refer back to the first of our webinar series again. The link is on marsh.com/UK, and then through our events page in the risk management series. If you go through that, that was discussed in some detail last week. So rather than go over it again, now I'll refer you back to that. But obviously a critical issue that impacts almost all organisations at the moment. Switching to the other end of the spectrum though, James, a lot of the intelligence we're seeing is focusing on providing advice for larger businesses. We've got someone here who says that my business is an SME with circa 80 staff. Is there any specific advice you'd recommend to SMEs or areas within your presentation that you should be focused on?
Yeah, so the slide that I talked through, which explored some of the practical things that organisations can do to help staff return to a place of work. So desk spacing, for example, increased cleaning regimes, maybe a ban on visitors for a period of time, that kind of thing. That's what I'd be focusing on. Those are very practical things that you can do right now, really, and do with your staff. I think I'll probably use this opportunity also to mention that when you're communicating with your staff about what you're planning to do and what you have done, don't forget to contact and keep engaged with those staff that you may have furloughed, particularly if you're planning to bring them back again into the business. They need to be part of this process as well. Otherwise it will cause you problems later down the track, I think.
Yeah, thanks. That's absolutely in tune with Nick's earlier message about engaging and maintaining contact with community suppliers and staff. Really important that everyone keeps that top of mind right now. One last question, maybe we've got time for a couple more. Question about the modelling approach. So Very interesting and clearly sophisticated approach to looking at the impact on businesses. But what sort of data do we need to actually run that process? Maybe Nick, I can ask you to cover that.
Yes, sure. So we would work with a client organisation with whatever they have, but typically we would expect sort of client workforce demographic information, any financial planning or analysis models that they that they have in place already, and their own forecasting methodologies that they have. We operate quite a sort of flexible approach, as I highlighted, and in practice, most organizations will have parts of what I described. So we would look to integrate what they have already and complement it with maybe the bits that they haven't got, or maybe validate some of the pieces they're less sure about, in order to sort of come up with the best possible output and information.
Great, thanks, Nick. So, look, I think that's all the time we've got for today. I'd like to thank both of you, Nick and James, for your time today and for participating in today's discussion. I'd also like to thank all of you who've joined us both today and throughout this series. We know there's a lot of demands on your time. We really appreciate you choosing to spend some of that time with us virtually. We'll be sending out a replay to everyone who registered and attended today. Please don't hesitate to reach out to your Marsh representative for any questions or concerns you might have as you continue to manage the impact on this pandemic. For more information and resources to aid you in your response to the current outbreak, please visit our COVID-19 resource hub on marsh.com/UK. You'll find all of our current thought leadership, solutions, advice, and links through to the webinar series that we've been running. You can also stay up to date on Marsh News by following Marsh Global on Twitter and following us also on LinkedIn. Please don't forget to visit our events page again on marsh.com/UK and register for the upcoming claims webinar, which is on Tuesday at 1 p.m, and to see all of the risk management webcast replay content. Thank you again for joining us today, and stay safe. Thank you.